All right, this morning we'll look at something in Baptist history, and the 1730s and 1740s are a time known as the Great Awakening, or actually the First Great Awakening. This was a time when actually there was a great revival that spread through the British Isles, and then George Whitefield, the primary preacher of that time, that evangelistic movement, he came to the colonies in the 1740s and began to preach with much anticipation. People were praying before he came, and God just swept through New England. Just thousands of people were saved. Just an unbelievable time in American history. And primarily in the areas where this revival broke out would be Connecticut and Massachusetts, New Hampshire, those areas. The state church was the Congregational Church, and by that I mean, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but the state church means that the state fully supported the church. Both of them were one. They were you were on the outside if you were a member of another denomination, and taxes were paid and collected from the state to pay for the congregational clergy. So that's something that's going to change after this, but we'll talk about that. But so the existing church, the members of the existing church, did not look very favorably on the new converts. These people were saved, being saved in this great wave of evangelism that sweeps through New England, and they were very suspicious of this new personal and emotional religion that the new converts who were being saved were coming with, and they called these newly saved people the New Lights. So we have the New Lights for the people that were saved in this revival and this time, and the Old Lights, which are the members of the old Congregational Church. So you have these two sets of people, and the Old Lights are very suspicious of the New Lights, and of course they weren't saved. They had every right to be suspicious of the New Lights. They were going to be trouble because they started reading their Bible, and they started realizing that what they were learning in the Congregational Church was not what they're finding in the Bible. And so at first, most of the New Lights thought they could go back into the churches and really reform the churches from the inside out, and they did that because there really wasn't any place else to go at that moment. And they did that. Many of those people went back into those old churches. They found that those old members were not willing to change, and so then we have the events that grew out of that. We'll talk about it today. But about that time, in the 1724 actually, a boy was born to a respectable member of a congregational family named Isaac Backus. Isaac Backus grew up in this home, this congregational home. He would have been early teens, maybe 11, 12 years old when that Great Awakening is sweeping through in New England. In 1741, revival broke out in Backus's hometown. In November of that year, after falling into deep conviction, Isaac Backus was saved in 1741. I think he was about 17 years old at that time. Now, as I said, the churches, the Old Lights, did not look favorably. They looked maybe with suspicion on the New Lights. And Backus and other converts were somewhat reluctant to join the Congregational Church, to go back into the Congregational Church. I said they would eventually think, okay, we can reform it from the inside out. But after some time of realizing we can't even take, really what bothered Backus was he was unable to take the ordinance of the Lord's Supper without being a member of the state church. And so he joined that church to be able to partake of the Lord's Supper as he felt he should. Of course, in time, they found that this attempt to revitalize the old church was not going to work, and eventually there was such an impasse in the churches that Backus and many others like him during this time, but Backus and many others there were excommunicated from the Congregational Church November 10th, 1745. Backus had been called to preach, and so he began his own church, and he became what was known as a separatist. And there were separatist churches. They didn't really have a denominational name, but they were separate from the state church. They were separate from the Congregational Church, and they called these people separatists, or these churches separatist churches. He felt that God was calling him to be an evangelist. He traveled throughout Rhode Island and Connecticut and Massachusetts, really used of God in those places. He went back into Massachusetts and started in his separatist church, and there with these new lights, these people that had been saved, he set up a church and began to worship. But even within that church, there began to be this Baptist thinking. As people read their Bibles, they realized that, first of all, infant baptism is not found in the Bible, and also sprinkling is not found in the Bible. So you have this issue within these churches of this great kind of debate within these churches of immersion or sprinkling. These are good people, these are saved people, but they're just coming from centuries of this old way of thinking back in England and now in America. And so actually what's interesting is Backus had married a Baptist girl, and she may have contributed to the fact that he was really studying his Bible and trying to decide, what would God have him do. And after agonizing over this matter for a number of years, Backus and 6 of his church members in 1751, they were immersed, and they broke from this separatist church again, and he began the First Baptist Church in Middlebury, Massachusetts. He would pastor there for almost 60 years until his death, and God used him greatly. But the untold, or I should say what I haven't mentioned, is Backus became a tremendous fighter, writer, speaker for religious freedom in early America. And his name is upheld by our founding fathers, and George Washington himself had him come numerous times to the Continental Congress and speak on this matter of religious freedom. Backus would probably be one of the most influential, if not the most influential, preachers in that area, preaching and speaking to the founding fathers about religious freedom. I put up, I don't know if you can read that or not, there's a quote from him there. I'll read you another quote, which is interesting. He said, "When church and state are separate, the effects are happy, and they do not at all interfere with each other. But when they have been confounded together, no tongue nor pen can fully describe the mischiefs that will ensue." And these are just a couple of his quotes on religious freedom, and what a tremendous influence he was on the founding of our nation. And as I said, speaking frequently, directly in a room like this to the founding fathers in the Continental Congress, and God greatly used his influence, certainly as a pastor, but as a real force for religious freedom in early America. So this morning, just want to thank the Lord for Isaac Backus. His name is to be revered in Baptist circles, and certainly in American history for what he did and the help that he gave the founding fathers in determining how the country should be set up. I want to thank the Lord for him and his ministry and his godly wife that tried to help him see. It's interesting, she's a whole other story. She came from a family, her great-grandfather served in Oliver Cromwell's army back in England, and they were Baptists. As you might remember, we talked about it. Oliver Cromwell gathered the Baptists around him because they were so interested, they were fascinated with him and his fight for religious freedom over in England. And so her family goes way back into the Baptist history. And he married her. He asked her to marry him, knowing full well who she was. She was a Baptist and knew what she was. And God used her, I believe, really in his life to help him in that decision. So I want to thank the Lord for these godly people and their influence on American history.